rise.
Welcome to the Irish Courts podcast. This is our first series where we explore seminal cases and key moments in the evolution of the Irish courts. In this episode, we trace the story of the David Norris cases, which challenged the constitutionality of 3 pieces of legislation that made it illegal to engage in any acts of male homosexual expressions of intimacy. David Norris had to make the case that the legislation was inconsistent with the Constitution. That was a mountain to climb. There was little or no help in any previous cases decided in Ireland. The Constitution did not say anything expressly about privacy autonomy or relationships outside the simple model of married homosexual couples. The Supreme Court had decided in McGee that married people had a constitutional right to privacy, including a right to use contraception, and the state was more or less told to keep out of their bedrooms. But in 1977, few people believed that homosexual men engaged in relationships outside the law of state or church could or should have the same legal rights as married couples. These David Norris cases are explored by 3 people who bore witness to and were directly involved in this legal battle. Retired senator, scholar and human rights activist David Norris, author Colm Tóibín, and founding member of the Campaign for Homosexual Law Reform, and former President of Ireland, Mary McAleese.
The tragedy for me in all of this was, first of all, that he had to do that we had to go to court. The laws that were impacting the lives of homosexuals were largely Victorian laws. They were British Empire laws, which were not reflected upon. And so it was left to advocacy groups like the Campaign for Homosexual Law Reform to tackle those laws, those old empire laws. The main one goes back to 1860.
3 pieces of legislation were challenged as unconstitutional. The first 2 dated from 1861. Section 61 of the Offences against the Person Act, 1861, provided that anyone who committed the abominable crime of buggery, either with mankind or with an animal, would be liable to life imprisonment. Section 62 dealt with attempted buggery, assault with the intent to commit buggery, and indecent assault upon a male person. Each of these carried a sentence of up to 10 years. The third was Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1885, which made it an offence for a man to commit or to be party to or procure or attempt to procure in public or in private any act of gross indecency. The penalty was up to 2 years.
The laws at that time were dreadful. They were just dreadful. It meant that any 2 gay people who wanted to enter into an open relationship as a couple really did so at their peril. Any form of sexual contact between them, the offence was the abominable crime of buggery, as it was described rather descriptively in the old legislation, so that homosexual men in particular who fell in love with a partner, wanted to live and have a perfectly normal life, including sexual relations, were always in danger of being prosecuted. And of course, their lives were always lived in that shadow, in that shade. The opportunity had always existed, of course, for our legislature to reflect on those laws and to update them, but it had not done so. And so David was really left, and the gay rights movement was really left with no alternative but to try and seek the help of our court system, because there were no champions of change in the legislature, in the Dáil, none. There was not a cohort of courageous people who were prepared to take on this issue then, which just shows you how far we've come in many ways. So it went to the courts. Also, with the law, there's a kind of an aura around that law that cascades out homophobia, All of that had to be tackled. And they did so, fair dues to them, on a pro bono basis, because At that time, we didn't have things like GoFundMe. The campaign for homosexual law reform was not a wealthy operation in the least. So these lawyers, top-class lawyers, took on what was a massive case, a groundbreaking case, with no prospect they'd ever get paid.
The central argument was David's right to privacy, to be able to engage in homosexual acts in private.
Privacy was the essential thing. I just thought it was wrong that people could be put in jail for loving each other.
David Norris was represented by Senior Counsel Garrett Cooney and Senior Counsel Paul Kearney, both now deceased, and then Senior Counsel and former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson.
We went along, and it was quite funny, actually, because Garrett Cooney, SC, stood up on the first day and he said, my client, Mr. Norris, is a congenital, irreversible homosexual. And that was news to me. I said, well, we'll go with it.
And the problem David Norris had was that he had not been arrested. He had not been openly discriminated against. He had not lost his job. He was immensely successful. He was immensely popular. He really was very hard for him in the court to say what exactly his problem was. Now, in order to really say what his problem was, you'd have to go very far back into the whole idea of what being homosexual means in what we might call a dark time. That the whole idea that if the law, the very law, was saying that your way of loving, the rituals around loving, for example, marriage, or indeed the very essence of love between two people, which is sexuality, that these things were forbidden, the idea of being excluded from ritual. In a country, especially like Ireland, where those rituals around, say, weddings, engagements, that obviously you were not to be part of that, but because of the law, until the law was changed, nothing really could proceed. And the idea that love, the whole idea of love, for example, in 1984, in George Orwell's book, the punishment, the absolute total end, the final punishment will be that the two characters in the book will be forbidden to love. These are very difficult things to explain in a court. But that the actual Constitution suddenly mattered here because there's a thing called the spirit of the Constitution. Phrases such as bodily integrity, phrases about privacy, other clauses in the Constitution that, if interpreted in a certain way, could lead you to believe that under the law in Ireland, that this umbrella we lived under, the Constitution, could be invoked. But this is a very hard thing to do when there's nothing specific in the Constitution that mentions homosexuality in a society that is governed by a constitution like ours. Since we're talking about rights to privacy, but we're also talking about rights to liberty. Are there limits to liberty? Are there limits to the taking away of liberty? What might those limits be? My right to love has to be a fundamental right. Now, what does a fundamental right mean under our Constitution?
It's a great thing. Irish people have the right to take action under the Constitution, and that's a very valuable right.
And the strange atmosphere in the court. I was writing for the magazine in Dublin, and the very strange thing, which I've never really understood, is when I went down to the court, there were no journalists there. I'm saying there was no one there. Now, at one point, Carol Coulter turned up from the Irish Press. Later, she became an Irish Times journalist. But there was a sense of whatever was happening there was really strange. Even the way in which Mary Robinson was presenting the case was very slow, legalistic, very, very careful. I mean, there was a sense of nobody quite knowing how to couch this, except, of course, in the best legal terms. So obviously, from a legal point of view, it was probably brilliant. But from someone watching it, you thought, there needs to be something said about what it means to be gay in a society where being gay is not only invisible, but illegal. And also, if this is happening, that the fact that large numbers of Irish citizens are not in prison is on the whim of the Garda authorities or the Department of Justice. So you had to invoke something that's very hard to invoke, which is the idea of what it feels like to be invisible and how much the law matters. It struck me that this is really serious. But to explain what it means to be gay in a society where homosexuality is illegal. It requires almost a novelist, requires, a certain sort of psychiatrist, a certain sort of sociologist, or a certain sort of priest.
Yes, there was Joe O'Leary, there was Micheál McGrail, they were both priests. There was Rose Robertson, who started Parents' Inquiry for the parents of gay children in London.
Micheál McGrail, God rest his soul, was terrific. I remember Micheál was there the first night that we had the first meeting of the campaign for homosexual law reform. He was a sociologist, he was a social scientist. He was a very powerful witness. He had conducted very extensive research and published very important work investigating prejudice and tolerance in Ireland. So he knew how deeply went the prejudice. He knew how toxic it was. And he took a side that he believed was fully consonant with his faith, though it was not fully consonant with the teaching of his church, which of course was also deeply embedded in that law. Because even though that law was old Victorian law, it derived essentially from Christian teaching, both in the Catholic churches and the Protestant churches.
And there was one funny moment where a priest came in to give evidence. This was a priest called Joseph O'Leary. I mean, he's a serious theologian, he still is. At one point, when he was talking about homosexuality, said we. No, we don't. And a large barrister with a very large, old-fashioned Dublin barrister's voice, posh, said, "Excuse me, Father, did you say we? Did you say we, Father?" And I presumed later, because when I spoke to Father O'Leary about it, that it was an awful moment for him. He said no, that he'd never hidden his homosexuality in the church, that it wasn't actually a big moment, but he did remember it.
I wanted witnesses because there had been a blanket of secrecy over the whole question of homosexuality beforehand. And I wanted to tear that away. And that was the whole point of it, because previously homosexual people had been photographed in shadow and from behind and so on. And when I did the first television interview, they said, "Oh, we'll put you in shadow and we'll have you back to the camera." And I said, well, in that case, you can do it yourself, because I'm not going to be doing it, because people have got away with the idea that gay people are monsters waiting to attack them and so on and so forth. And I want to come forward as a perfectly ordinary citizen. But I was openly gay from the very beginning.
So in 1977, David Norris lost his case in the High Court. The presiding judge, Mac Williams, wrote in his judgment, "Although I am of the opinion that Section 11 of the Act of 1885 is unsatisfactory in many respects, and that the Oireachtas should, if possible, give serious consideration to its continuation in its present form, I am also of the opinion that none of the arguments advanced establish that it is unconstitutional."
And his judgment was really fascinating, because it said there was a surprisingly large number of gay people in Ireland, that they weren't vicious, that they weren't child molesters and all this kind of stuff. And then suddenly it took a turn and said, nevertheless, despite this, because of the democratic nature of the Irish Constitution, I have to find against the plaintiff.
The case was over, and that was it. And I didn't think about it. He didn't win. And that was the end of that. And then it didn't occur to me what was coming.
This was not to be the end. David Norris and his team went on to the Supreme Court to challenge the High Court decision.
The disappointing thing was that, having gone to the court and having gone all the way up through the courts, right to the top, right to the Supreme Court, that the court itself lacked courage.
In 1983, the Supreme Court was split in the case, but held against David Norris 3-2. Judge O'Higgins wrote in his majority judgment, "Homosexuality has always been condemned in Christian teaching as being morally wrong. It has equally been regarded by society for many centuries as an offence against nature and a very serious crime. On the grounds of the Christian nature of our state, and on the grounds that the deliberate practice of homosexuality is morally wrong, that it is damaging to the health both of the individuals and the public, and finally, that it is potentially harmful to the institution of marriage, I can find no inconsistency with the Constitution in the laws which make such a conduct criminal. It follows, in my view, that no right of privacy as claimed by the plaintiff can prevail against the operation of such criminal sanctions.
But there it is in black and white. I moved from in Dublin to McGill magazine to be editor. Vincent Brown then, from being editor of McGill, went over to the Sunday Tribune to be editor of the Sunday Tribune. And one day in that spring, Vincent came over to McGill on Friday afternoon to say, have you seen this? And I said, what did you expect? Like, would you ever think that in any area of Irish life now, there's ever going to be change from the courts, from the politicians? Like this society's dead. In other words, the economy was dead, politics was dead, any possibility of reconciliation in the North was dead, the Catholic Church was still operating in this extraordinary way. I just said, I'm not covering it. I mean, there's no point in us deploring a Supreme Court judgment. I'm not getting involved. We're not going to do it. Vincent said, you're insane. This is really important. Have you seen the judgment? I said, I'm not reading them. What were readers going to get from this other than something they already knew? And our job was, strangely, as journalists, to tell people things they didn't already know. But Vincent did really cover this in the Sunday Tribune, but because there were things in one of the judgments that he thought were beyond belief. Only later that I realised how right he'd been. It might have seemed that it was about gay rights, but actually it was about liberty. It was the idea that you could say that that law that suggests that men, for expressing their love to each other, could be imprisoned, could lose their liberty, could be held by the state, could be taken from a court in handcuffs to a place where they would serve out a sentence. The problem with his judgment is that none of it's true. I mean, there's the evidence he's bringing before himself about men spreading disease and about all those business of unhappiness and all that. There's also an idea in his judgment. If gay men went around too much, a lot of other men who wouldn't be gay up to that point would join them in their gayness. Now, that is the funniest for anyone who's gay. You know so much how many people are just not gay. And you learn this very young to your disadvantage when you're 15 that all of your friends are straight and you're the one who's gay. The idea that you could somehow, I mean, it's just the most outlandish idea. There were many outlandish ideas in his judgment.
I think it was absolute nonsense because he wandered away from the evidence that was given. He completely disregarded that. One of the other judges, Justice Henchy and Justice McCarthy, they both said that I had won.
There were two strong dissenting judgments from Judge Henchy and Judge McCarthy. Judge Henchy agreed that there was no breach of the constitutional guarantee of equality, but found a breach of the right to privacy.
Two of the other judges, who were highly intelligent people, they signed O'Higgins' judgment without a thought. They just didn't care.
Two of them merely assented to the Chief Justice's judgment, and one of them was later made Chief Justice. In the United States now, among historians, there's a huge interest in silence as to who was silent, who did not speak.
I regard the case that David lost in our court here as supremely cowardly and redolent of a very defensive, protective Ireland, attitudes and prejudices and stereotypes. David would walk out onto the streets and face the most outrageous vitriol and do so with the thick skin that David has, but that I know behind which lies a man with a soft heart, would never have treated another human being that way, ever, who nursed his hurt in the silence of his own heart. It would be very well worthwhile every young adolescent in Ireland in school, part of their preparation for citizenship, to read that judgment and to realise how far we have come, and to realise you don't come that journey by accident. You don't come that journey by doing nothing.
We're dealing not with the power of the Catholic Church. were dealing with the weirdness of a generation of powerful Irish men and the weirdness manifesting itself in relation to homosexuality. Gay people were not only invisible, but the very idea of that for a lot of those men was so anathema. And all of us knew this from our families. There was one old uncle, or there was, don't tell your grandfather, that generation, they were closed down on that matter.
But I also am taken with the fact that I got involved in the campaign from the beginning, and my father-in-law came to live with Martin and I in 1982. And fairly soon after he came, when we were inviting people out to the house, quite a lot of gay friends would come and we'd have gay couples. A couple of friends I'm thinking of in particular who used to sit on the couch and hold hands. And my father-in-law's two eyes would be nearly falling out of his head going, what in the name of the Lord is going on here? And then, over a cup of tea and a bun, he would get to know them and got to know them, became a fierce defender of them. Because somewhere inside himself, he recognised the stereotype. He recognised the attitudinal prejudice. In that encounter, he stripped away the old stuff that had been put into so many people that they had just picked up off the stones, really, in the same way that my husband would say the same thing. I remember during one of the campaigns going to the house of a gay couple. They bought a house together. This was really unheard of almost. They were holding a housewarming party. We were in the car going to the party. I had statutory house gift, the yucca plant in the front of the car to bring to it. And I thought that I better tell my husband where we were going, whose party it is, and it's their housewarming. My husband is now, one of the most extraordinary champions of gay rights, to the point where he simply will have nothing to do with the Catholic Church at all because of its attitude and because of what it has done. I'll stay with it and, fight the peace out, but he is just so appalled. So utterly appalled. But back in those days, he was still the young footballer, although he was never in person for locker room language then or since, thank God. Somewhere he had picked up a fear. And I told him where we were going and he stopped the car. And he said to me, Mary, if there's anything untoward in this house, we're leaving. And I said, Martin, first of all, there will be nothing untoward in this house. But yes, if there is, of course we leave. So we get to the house, we knock at the door, and I can still remember the door being opened by Father Brian Darcy in his full clerical gear. And he said, would you for God's sake get in there? He said, we're about to start Mass. And we went in and it was all the aunties and the grannies and the neighbours and the friends. And the house was set up for a house Mass. And Father Brian said it. My husband sat the whole evening talking to one of the young men's grandmothers, like my own father-in-law later was able to say, we've come a journey on this subject, but we've come through the knowledge of people who are gay. You see, in the past, people didn't know who was gay and who wasn't. They might have vaguely suspected, but they didn't know because of the shadows that were inhabited by people. But now this grandmother was able to say, well, I've known him since he was born and he's a good person. So that evening when we left, I said to my husband, a thing that he often reminds me of, I said, I hope you were suitably mollified. The only person with a bad thought in their head going through that door was you. A big learning curve. Here was a family steeped in the Catholic Church in Ireland when they wanted to celebrate the relationship and the house that was to be their new home. They wanted a family Mass. And that, to me, was beautiful, even though they still can't have that today, regrettably, except in secret.
I think you can see this in the light of a 30-year period when this was an episode that actually opened up space, but it didn't look like that at the time. But I think more seriously, the question, I think, for judges in Ireland and for the law in Ireland is, look, this is a very dark moment in the history of the Supreme Court. Because the Chief Justice issued a judgment which didn't just have implications for people's liberty, but literally and openly was about ideas of liberty. That men could be taken from bedrooms in handcuffs and brought to court and given draconian sentences under the law. The Chief Justice of Ireland, in his judgment, moved away from all norms of judgment making. He did not refer to evidence given. He made up his own evidence and took it as fact. Now, that is the Chief Justice. That's what he did. That was assented to by one judge who later became Chief Justice. Now, if this is your history, you've got to live with it and own it, because you haven't done so up to now. And that when this occurred, nobody spoke, nobody said anything, years went by. It may be only now that we're starting to look at the enormity and the sheer nerve of this judgment. And that it isn't as though he went to the cardinal or he went to the archbishop and asked him what to do. Tom Higgins didn't do that. He wouldn't have done that. He did it himself. It doesn't look good now. But I'm not saying it doesn't look good because he wasn't as liberal as I was then. But from a legal point of view, from how a judge proceeds, it really is an awful moment. And yet, when it happened, it seemed okay. When you look at that period, it's so easy to misread it and I've misread it. In other words, to have been there then and thought on the abortion referendum, on the first divorce referendum, and on this judgment, that Ireland was simply a backward place and would always remain so. But what you realise now is that this was the beginning of change. That in order to get the change, Norris and Mary Robinson had to go into court. And Mary Robinson had to speak in the most measured way. And Norris had to be someone who would not lose his job, who would not lose his friends, who would not lose his family. You know, that his privilege was absolutely watertight so that he could not be damaged. You know, it's going into the court, realising we'll probably lose, going to the Supreme Court, that this was just a part of how change happens in a society like Ireland. You begin by opening the subject.
You absolutely had to have someone like David who just wouldn't give up. You had to have people gathered around him. You had to have human rights activists who believed in this as a human rights cause and who just were not prepared to let it go. We were also very fortunate that we were not stuck with a situation that whatever our Supreme Court said was the end of the matter. Thanks be to goodness. We were members of the Council of Europe. We were able then to go, to the European Court of Human Rights. That was the route. That was nerve-wracking for everybody. I mean, I think at one stage, David was putting his house on the line, put a lot of people's lives on hold, including his own, while this was being fought through the courts.
I enjoyed it thoroughly. The entire experience. I mean, the only time I had a little bit of hesitation when government were awarded costs against me, and that was £75,000, which was an awful lot of money in those days.
Legal cases are very expensive, and these are people who can command huge fees. And in fairness to them, didn't ask for them, just hoped that at the end of the day, that there would be an award that would give them access to funding for the case. I have to say they were the real champions here, people who took this on because it was a cause for them. It was a human rights cause.
Now, when the Irish state went to the European Court of Human Rights, one of the things that the Irish state said was, well, we don't use the law. And you can just imagine you're an old sort of Protestant judge from Westphalia. You say, well, you don't use the law. Why would you want the law to be there? That idea somehow that it didn't matter, that this law was draconian, that this sentencing of a gay man for having sex with someone he loved could be draconian.
And so it was the European Court of Human Rights that eventually gave a decision in favour of David and in favour of getting rid of those appalling old laws. But of course, the awful thing about that is that on the day the judgment was received, great and wonderful as that was, there was no mechanism for implementing it directly in Ireland unless the Parliament, unless the Dáil passed the legislation which got rid of those terrible laws. Now, they didn't have to do that. There was no obligation really on them to do that directly from the European Court. The European Court of Justice, the decisions do not have direct impact on our everyday laws. They don't have what we call direct effect. So here we were again. David had won brilliantly, of course, thanks to that great legal team, thanks to the European Convention on Human Rights that actually cared about equality. But now it was the case that the people who had been cowardly in the Dáil people who had done nothing to help. The campaign was now reliant on them to take seriously the decision of the European Court of Human Rights and to now tackle the laws and get rid of the laws, essentially.
So that was 1988. And then I think each year they were entitled, the court, to come back to say, what are you doing about this?
And it was not until 1993 that the Criminal Laws Sexual Offence Bill was introduced, the enactment of which resulted in the decriminalisation of sexual acts between men. This was 16 years after David Norris took his case to the High Court.
So it was and remains the case that it was a woman of courage who did that. That was Maura Geoghegan-Quinn.
Yes, absolutely. It was a long time, but that was actually quite good. And it also meant that the Minister for Justice at that time had been Mr. Burke, who wasn't a known liberal. But by the time it came around, it was Maura Geoghegan-Quinn.
And there was one more point to be debated in this change of law, the question of the age of consent. The age of consent between heterosexual couples was 18, and it was proposed that the age of consent for homosexual couples was to be 21.
It really was quite a serious debate, the age of consent question. Because if she was going to make it 21, this was really something we're still going to have to go back and back and back. You could see a 20-year campaign. Now, it was 21 in Britain at the time. They would change it pretty soon. But in the middle of all this comes Mrs. Moore. She went to Maura Geoghegan-Quinn as a mother a few weeks before the legislation was to go into the door. She had a gay son. And she said, he's 18. Now, what am I going to say to him if this is 21? Like, after all we've been through, all the hope, what am I going to say to him? Now, you're a mother. What would you say to your 18-year-old son? And you know that he's in love with his boyfriend, and if you do, you'll go to jail. Like, what would that mean to him? And Maura Geoghegan-Quinn, it seems, said, you're right. And that conversation, that's the rumour, is meant to have changed. You know, the Maura Geoghegan-Quinn suddenly had a mother talking to her, not some big gay rights person coming in, marching into her, demanding their rights. A mother saying, like, just help me with this. And she became famous as Mrs. Moore. And everyone talked about her as Mrs. Moore. And everybody thought, you know, Maura Geoghegan-Quinn was marvellous. But if only it wasn't for Mrs. Moore, maybe she might have been swayed by some other group to say it had to be 21. And so it became 18, and we were more liberal than the Brits. In an interesting Irish way, the whole thing was over. It just, you know, it was as though it had never been there. And the following week, it was over.
It was a really, really tough journey. Of that, there is no doubt. It would have been just dreadful if David's case had been lost in the European Court of Human Rights, but there was such faith in it and such faith in the concept that this was a human rights issue and that it was a human rights issue that would appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, because the whole issue of homosexual law reform was gathering momentum, not just in Ireland and in the United Kingdom, but elsewhere. Throughout Europe, throughout many of the countries that are members of the Council of Europe. So it was a coming thing, you know. And it was good that Ireland helped to make the law and then to break the old law into pieces.
But, you know, I think Irish people have always been decent and tolerant.
And it was the cases of David Norris that, as Colm Tóibín said, was the beginning of change. To defend the right to love. To bring homosexuality out of the shadows. The legal analysis of the right to privacy by the majority judgment in the Supreme Court is no longer considered by judges or lawyers to be of great weight. By contrast, the brave dissenting judgment of Judge Seamus Henchy has been a lasting influence. He identified personal privacy as part of the range of rights, freedoms and immunities necessary to ensure the dignity and freedom of the individual, and identified the individual as a vital human component of the social, political and moral order established by the Constitution. This analysis has been of huge significance in the development of constitutional thinking about individual rights. Sometimes the losing side wins in the long run, and dissenting judgments come to be more influential than the majority. Putting those arguments out there to be judged by future generations is an important function of the Supreme Court. You have been listening to the Irish Courts podcast, a curious broadcast production with the Court Service and the Judiciary. Thank you to our contributors, Colm Tóibín, Mary McAleese and David Norris.